I am excited to be here this morning to, first of all, to welcome you all to our state, and those of you who aren't from Delaware, a hearty Delaware welcome, and thanks for making it up here through our first winter storm of the season. But this is a very timely conversation we're going to have today about the global challenges and opportunities that face our country and how Delaware's role in the world, America's role in the world, matters probably more now than it ever has before, and especially here in our state. And it's great, especially to be here with the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition and my great friend Chris Coons, our senator from Delaware. I don't think anyone in this room needs to be told what an increasingly important role Senator Coons is playing, not only in the arena that we're going to discuss today, but in so many of the critical problems and challenges that face our country. I am just so proud that he represents us in the United States Senate. I'm so proud to call him a friend. Chris Coons, thank you very much for all you do. Chris and I work for Chris very briefly, as he's years of therapy have gotten it out of his system. But I worked for him for several years when he was the county executive of Newcastle County. I served as his chief administrative officer, and I ditched him to become Secretary of State, and I don't think he was too happy about it. But a couple years later, he got to be a United States Senator, so he kind of got the last laugh. But again, Chris, just doing a tremendous job for our state and for our country. I'm a state secretary of state. I'm not one of those guys that goes out and negotiates treaties and stuff like that all around the world. But I see in my own job on a daily basis the growing global reach of both our large and small businesses here in Delaware, and an increasing understanding that in order to compete in a global economy, we've got to look outside our borders in order to grow. And you don't have to look really very far to see examples of that. A few of you in here know that one of my roles is to serve as the chairman of the Diamond State Port Corporation. Our port's located just a couple miles to the east. And I was examining the breakfast provided for you this morning, those bananas that you eat, hopefully they're Dole or Chiquita bananas, came through our port of Wilmington probably sometime last week to make it out on the breakfast buffet this morning. Those little clementines that you're going to buy this weekend at the supermarket and give your kids and your grandkids, they came from Morocco. The pineapples that you'll eat this weekend came from Central America. The list goes on and on of examples of all of this international trade that comes into our state just through the little tiny port of Wilmington. We recently entered into a new partnership with a group called Gulftainer. They're owned by a company headquartered in the United Arab Emirates. They want to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in our state to build a new port, which is great, but if you don't have good trade agreements and you don't have international cooperation, you don't have international trade, and you don't have the business to sustain hundreds of millions of dollars of investment in a new port. And why is it all important to people like me? Not just because we get to eat good fruit, but because we create thousands of jobs, from stevedores to longshoremen to forklift operators to the produce supervisor at the supermarket. Good paying jobs. The average salary of a job at our port last year was $80,000. That's a wage that you can support a family on, right? And that's what we're all about. That's what I'm all about as a Secretary of State. On the other end of the spectrum, most of you know that Delaware is a state of incorporation. Secretary of State has a pretty big role in protecting the Delaware franchise. 2/3 of the Fortune 500 companies in America are headquartered in the state of Delaware. A majority of the publicly traded companies on the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ call Delaware their legal home, generates about $1.3 billion just from corporate franchise taxes to our in state revenues. And overall, if you count the jobs that are created through that activity, probably about 40% of our state revenue, and again, thousands of very good paying jobs for Delawareans. Final example, we run a little program called STEP program out of the Department of State. It is beautiful for its simplicity. It's a federally funded program out of the Small Business Administration. They give us some money. We use the money to help small businesses get in international markets. We've been able to take dozens of Delaware companies all over the world to get that experience in international markets. It's resulted in tens of millions of dollars in new business for those companies, new investment in Delaware, and again, more jobs for Delawareans. It's pretty simple. It's pretty simple. I know in this room everyone understands how interconnected our security and our prosperity are with the rest of the world. And at a time when Delaware's and America's role in the world is being debated here in Delaware, in Dover, and also on Capitol Hill, this discussion we're having today is a very timely one. And I know we're excited and energized to learn and discuss alongside Senator Coons and the USGLC why America must continue to be a global leader. So again, thank you for your participation today. It's important. It's important to you and to your businesses. It's important to our state. And ultimately, it's very important to our country. And so before we begin, I want to take a minute to recognize the men and women who are here today who have sacrificed so much for the defense of our nation. Will all the veterans in the room please rise so we can salute you and recognize your service? Thank you for all you do here in Delaware and our region and for keeping our country safe. Now to talk a little more about what brings us here today, here in Delaware, and about the USGLC's work around the country, I'd like to welcome Liz Schreier, the President and CEO of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. Liz, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Secretary, and good morning, everyone. What a terrific, fabulous crowd. I am so thrilled to be back in Delaware. We hosted a similar event last year. How many of you were here last year? Fabulous, welcome back. How many of you have been to one of the Opportunity Africa conferences before? Several of you, and some of you are new timers. Well, welcome to you all. We are thrilled to spend a big part of today together. Business leaders, the veterans, thank you for your service. Students that are here, faith leaders, community leaders, all together at a very critical time, as the Secretary just said, to talk about America's role in the world and how it matters to us here in Delaware and the Mid-Atlantic region, a time that I think is really significant, and who wouldn't show up to be with my friend, our champion, and your Senator, Chris Coons. How wonderful to be here with him. I want to begin by thanking, if you look at your program, there are 20 partners who made today possible. I want to thank them. I want to thank our sponsors for today that are listed on the program, Andrew and Bonnie Weiss from CRI Foundation, David Bonderman from Wildcat Foundation, Corteva AgroScience, all who made today possible, as well as USGLC's Global GIP, our Global International Project Partners, who literally travel all over the country with us to do projects like this and conversations like this. There's probably lots of reasons why you came today. My guess is many of you, I hope, came to learn and to take a look at what are some of the global challenges that we face today. Maybe you came to kind of unpack some of the global crises around the world, humanitarian crisis that exists. For example, today we are facing the largest humanitarian crisis in terms of migration in the world, 70 million people who are displaced in the world, 30 million who are suffering on the verge of starvation. Maybe you came to understand some of the challenges we face in competition that we're going to talk about, like those that are facing with China and other countries that are competing in the world in places like Africa. Or you came because you want to see the opportunities that are out there. There's networking opportunities of NGOs and businesses and public-private partnerships, and to learn about some of the innovative work that is happening in some of the breakout sections that you're going to hear about. What I hope that you do today is not only to learn and to engage, but to network with each other, and everybody to walk away with a new friend, a new contact, and a new opportunity to take action, to do something that when you walked in this morning, you didn't think about when you walk out this afternoon, and to make sure that you walk away with an extra card that you didn't have, an extra idea that you want to do. We at the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, this is what we're about. We're about making connections and engaging around this issue of America leading globally because it matters locally. We are known, in Washington Post once called us, the Strange Bedfellow Coalition. Now, we got that name because we bring unusual groups together. We have over 500 businesses and NGOs. You'll meet some of them in our breakout sessions. You'll meet one of our board members in just a few moments. Land O'Lakes and Procter & Gamble and Walmart and other businesses, as well as large international NGOs like Save the Children and World Vision. We are bipartisan. We have every former living Secretary of State that are members of our advisory council, led by Colin Powell. We have over 200 retired 3- and 4-star military leaders. We're in every state and so proud to be here in Delaware. And what brings us together is this belief that America needs to be engaged in the world. And part of that engagement is to make sure that we invest in our development and our diplomacy toolkit alongside defense. And that means the little 1% of our federal budget that supports our international, it's called our International Affairs budget, that's our State Department, that's our USAID programs, that's our Peace Corps programs. It's the people who battled against Ebola spreading from West Africa. It's the programs that we're going to talk to Ray Washburn, who runs our Development Finance Corporation, and it's the programs that help open markets for our goods and services here in Delaware. And the truth is that it's been under attack over the last couple of years. We've seen proposals in Washington that have wanted to cut over 30% of these programs. And it would have been devastating for the kinds of things we're going to talk about today. But what I want to share with you as my last thought is this, is that it is because of people like Senator Coons and Senator Corker, who you're going to meet later at lunch today, bipartisan rejection of these cuts to say, you know what, we should not pull back from the world. We have to be engaged in the world. And they have rejected these dramatic cuts to our engagement in the world and actually restored the programs and the resources in the world. And it is this bipartisan leadership that is very, very critical to supporting the development and the diplomacy programs. And what I would share with you is that there's not a lot of bipartisanship that is happening, as you might have noticed in Washington, but it's around these global development programs, it's around diplomacy that is happening more than ever in Washington. And in fact, in the last 4 years, more than a dozen pieces of legislation have actually passed around these programs. Pieces like issues like water, women and girls, world wildlife trafficking, programs on a range of issues because they inspire and they're good for America. And they are led by none other than Senator Coons. What I will tell you that when you look at every single piece of these global development, foreign policy pieces of legislation, there are people like Senator Corker and Senator Coons leading the way. You should be so proud that Senator Coons, he leads with his heart and he delivers with his smarts. And what I can tell you, he is one of the most respected individuals in Washington, and I have traveled with him around the world, and he is as respected around the world as he is here in Delaware, because he understands that what happens around the world really matters here in Delaware and here in the U.S. And what our mission is at USGLC is to build a better, safer, more prosperous world. When you look in the dictionary and you understand what that means, it says Senator Chris Coons. Please join me in welcoming Senator Chris Coons.
Well, thank you, Liz Schreier. Thank you both for the warm introduction, for your friendship and your genuine leadership. As we face the challenge of what is our role in the world as a country, I cannot think of a more important voice or a better partner than the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. So let's give Liz and her whole team a round of applause again and thank them for what they've done to pull this off. As you heard, this is not unique to Delaware, this event. USGLC convenes similar events in other cities around the country with House members, with senators, Republican and Democrat, to try and convene and bring together a community to say, yes, we care about our place in the world. And I'm thrilled to have them as a partner, and I'd be interested in your feedback about whether this is a good use of your time today, whether you meet new people who are of value, whether you learn something of significance, whether it helps advance your mission and your purpose for you to be here today. I'm also grateful to my dear friend Jeff Bullock, our Secretary of State. Jeff suffered mightily under my leadership in county government and escaped after 2 years to go on to much greater heights of serving our state as our Secretary of State. Jeff is a tremendous public servant here, and if you haven't had the chance to meet him before, in the decades that he has worked with Governor Carper as his chief of staff, with me in the county, with Governor Markell, he has just tirelessly contributed to moving our Port of Wilmington to a whole new level, to keeping our state finances balanced and focused, and to never letting us forget about the core reason most of us got into public service, which is to help other people. From his roots in Claymont to his service in Washington to his service in Dover, Jeff has been a tireless advocate for the values that are at the core of all of us who are in public service. And so I am grateful, Jeff, for everything you've done here and around the world. Please give Jeff a round of applause if you would, too. We've got some great panelists and speakers, so I should speak briefly and get out of the way. On the other hand, I'm a senator, so we're not allowed to do that. I've got to deliver a long filibuster here. No, folks, I will do my best to keep this relatively short. We have a remarkable array of Delawareans here, of Delaware companies like Corteva, of global companies like Land O'Lakes, not that Corteva is not also global, but Delaware headquartered, of some great friends and supporters who've come to support this event today, faith leaders, students, community figures, business leaders. This is a great convening, so thank you for investing your time with us today. Why does it matter to Delaware that we be engaged in the world? That's the central question I hope to help answer with you today. As you heard from Jeff, and as I'll repeat, there's 100,000 high-quality jobs here in Delaware that are directly connected to our ability to export goods and services to the rest of the world. From chicken farmers in the southernmost part of our state to technologists and researchers in the northernmost part of our state, from folks who work in finance and in corporate legal departments to people who work in manufacturing businesses in all corners of our state. It's worth about $4.6 billion a year, our exports to the world, and for a state our size, that's big business. We've also highlighted why this matters from our values perspective to faith leaders of all perspectives and backgrounds. Why does it matter that the United States has a place on the world stage, not because of our military strength alone, not because of our economic strength alone, but because of the values that have long animated our service at home and abroad? I think this is a critical moment for us to stand up and be heard on a bipartisan basis. The members of the Congress of the United States who still believe that what makes us special, what makes us different, is the way in which we have stood up and fought for human rights, freedom of the press and freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, the ability of a free people under rule of law to contest elections, to express themselves, to petition their government with grievances, and to be part of that great American experiment in democracy. As I've traveled the world on your behalf, I've been struck at how many other countries have sought to follow our example, have sought to change their societies in directions that give more individual liberty and freedom to their constituents and citizens, and how much, frankly, that is today at risk, as that very notion is under some attack in Washington. I think the conversations we're going to have today, they will touch on specific undertakings and challenges, different organizations and mechanisms, but it is that values question that is most centrally at issue here. Some of you know why I first became, that's worth a round of applause, I'll take that. Some of you know that before I was elected to the U.S. Senate 8 years ago, I served as county executive and county council president. Before that, I spent 8 years as in-house counsel for a Delaware-based global manufacturing company that operates in dozens of countries all over the world. I've had the opportunity to see how this matters at the grassroots level here in Delaware. But as a young man, as a college student in 1984, I went and spent 6 months in Kenya, living all over the country. And my life was changed by the remarkable hospitality, by the huge generosity of spirit, by the profound focus on family and tradition of the people who opened their homes and hearts to me across Kenya 34 years ago. And just 3 years after that, I went to South Africa and volunteered for 3 months with Bishop Tutu and many others in the South African Council of Churches during the height of the anti-apartheid movement and the last gasp of the most racist government on the planet in the middle of my lifetime. That was a riveting experience and an opportunity to see how people of all backgrounds in South Africa came together to risk their liberty, their security, and their lives in confronting the apartheid regime. And that helped me believe that what I'd been told as a child in Sunday school about loving your neighbor wasn't just esoteric, wasn't just abstract, but that there is a role for the United States in loving our neighbors, whether they are literally a few blocks away on the east side, whether they are in the highlands, whether they are in Kibera, or whether they are in the best-off suburbs in Nairobi, that we have a calling to do our very best to, in an efficient way, in an effective way, reach out to and connect with our neighbors all over the globe. And I have been so blessed to have partners in Congress and in service in the Trump administration who share that view and who share that understanding of our calling. As you heard from Liz Schreier, the head of the USGLC, one of the things that is most bipartisan at a time when bipartisan is not a word widely used in our nation's capital is support for development and diplomacy, and in particular support for this calling the United States has to show our values to the world. Later today, I'll be joined by my good friend, Senator Bob Corker, Republican senator from Tennessee, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, with whom I've had the opportunity to travel and to legislate. Look, Bob and I don't agree on a whole lot of things. He is a genuine conservative, fiscal conservative, social conservative. If you took these little scorecards that people use at election time, we'd have, XO, XO, X, right? We wouldn't agree on virtually anything. And I don't care. What I care about is that Bob Corker shares the same view of the United States and our place in the world, the value-centered role that we need to play in the world to sustain the alliances and the partnerships and the institutions that our soldiers fought for and sacrificed for over decades of conflict, from the Second World War to conflicts as current as today. The world order that we helped build with free societies around the planet 70 years ago, that we have secured with service and sacrifice for decades, is genuinely at risk. And without a bipartisan partner like Jeff Flake of Arizona, like Bob Corker of Tennessee, like Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma, Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, these programs would be profoundly under assault. Let me briefly explain what I'm referencing. Liz Schreier just said it, that our president proposed a 30% cut in all the funding for the development programs, for the diplomacy programs that are a critical complement to our defense programs. Yes, we have the strongest, most capable, most sophisticated, most expensive military in world history. But as Jim Mattis, Secretary of Defense himself has said, we cannot be successful in securing ourselves, our interest, and the world through a powerful military without the critical complement of effective development and diplomacy programs that help stabilize and secure fragile states, that help secure our alliances and partnerships, and that help prevent the necessity of our troops going into harm's way around the world. The president proposed cuts large and small in his budget both this year and last year. The small but agile, remarkable United States African Development Foundation, whose head, C.D. Gillen, is with us here today, it spends just $30 million a year. But it's light, it's agile, it's quick, and it can demonstrate new approaches to development. That program was to be eliminated. I went to my friend, Senator Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma, with whom I agree on nothing, except anything that has to do with Africa and development. And in a 5-minute conversation, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee agreed to step up and push back against his president and say, no, this is a good program. With all due respect, sir, this program deserves to survive, and here's why. And we've been successful in doing so. Much bigger efforts, much longer efforts, the Food for Peace program, which goes back decades, which feeds tens of millions of starving people around the world with the abundant production of our farmers, the most productive farmers on the planet. That program was slated for elimination, $3 billion. And Lindsey Graham of South Carolina has saved not just the Food for Peace program, but the Feed the Future program, which you'll hear more about from Beth Ford and other leaders from Corteva and from USAID about how these amazing and effective programs work. It's critical that we sustain our support for the appropriations that make these programs work. It's also critical that we pass the laws that make them possible. That's where Bob Corker comes in. Senator Corker and I have legislated on Water for the World Act, which President Obama signed into law in 2014, the Electrify Africa Act in 2016, to bring electricity to 600 million Africans across the continent, the Global Food Security Act, which authorized the Emergency Food Security Program for the first time, and just a few weeks ago, the BUILD Act, which is something I'm so excited we will now move to discussing, among other topics, with a great panel. BUILD stands for the Better Utilization of Investments Leading to Development. Isn't that nifty? B-U-I-L-D, the BUILD Act. What is it about? Give it a round of applause for an amazing acronym, folks. Briefly, there is a 40-year-old development finance institution in Washington named OPIC, and you're about to meet the very talented and capable leader of OPIC. The BUILD Act, a multi-year, disciplined, bipartisan effort across the House and the Senate and the Trump administration, doubled it in size from $30 billion to $60 billion in its ability to activate American private capital at no cost to the American taxpayer, to meet the opportunities of the developing world and growing markets, to have a development finance corporation, a new institution that will be as agile and have the same tools and private equity and local currency that our allies and partners have, and frankly, to meet the dramatic increase in Chinese investment all over the developing world. I've been to 29 countries in the continent of Africa on your behalf. I've had the honor of having our Congresswoman, Lisa Blunt Rochester, join me on one of those trips just last year. And everywhere I've gone, I've seen the same thing. The Chinese are investing at an unbelievable rate, and their footprint and their profile across the continent has accelerated beyond all imagining, several-fold increase just over the last 8 years, and at the same time, our trade relationships and our investment have dropped significantly. We came to a bipartisan agreement. The answer isn't tens of billions of dollars more in United States direct grants in government-to-government aid, especially not at a time when our president and many in Congress and the public want to cut those direct grants. The answer is to use what we're best at, which is private capital, finding ways to de-risk complex development projects and to make them transparent, to make them align with the values of the United States and the countries we're partnering with, and through that to help elevate millions of people out of poverty. This is an exciting thing for us to be talking about today. It's an exciting bipartisan initiative that's finally come to full fruition and success, and it shows the ways in which, when we put our values first and partisanship last, we can find a way to work together to help advance our place in the world. Folks, it's exciting to have an opportunity to recognize what bipartisanship can do, and I hope today you're going to learn some things about what Delaware can get from this opportunity and what we're doing together. Let me just thank Secretary of State Jeff Bullock, who is about to retake the podium and introduce our panel, and the folks who are here with me today, Ray Washburn, the head of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, who will be leading the new Development Finance Corporation into the future, and folks we'll hear from later today, as I mentioned, my friend Senator Bob Corker, Michael Gerson, a columnist for the Washington Post, who helped shape and create PEPFAR, the single greatest public health intervention by any nation in human history, which was the principal accomplishment of the Bush administration, in my view, saving at least 23 million lives from the scourge of HIV/AIDS. And yes. And helping to kick off and facilitate that afternoon panel, Michael Carranto, the president of the Delaware State Chamber of Commerce. I'm grateful to all of you for investing time with us this morning. I hope I've relatively briefly laid out what it is that brings us here today, what it is we're going to be discussing, and why this is an important conversation at this time in our nation's history. Thank you very much, and I look forward to our conversations throughout the day.
Okay, thank you, Senator. Time to get down to business. I'm excited to introduce our first discussion of the day. Our opening panel will explore how America's development and diplomacy programs open markets around the world, including in developing countries, linking to America's interests at home and in the Mid-Atlantic region. Just to bring it back to Delaware again, this discussion we're about to have is what takes a Delaware Secretary of State to Bogota, Colombia, not once but twice. An emerging economy, an increasingly stable political system, a government that wants to emulate our business law, Delaware's business law, relationships that will grow not only into economic opportunities, but jobs in both Colombia and here at home in Delaware. For the discussion, we're joined by three outstanding leaders whose careers truly embody America's commitment to global leadership. First, Beth Ford. Beth is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Land O'Lakes. She's held numerous leadership roles at the company, having previously served as Land O'Lakes Business Executive Vice President and its Chief Operating Officer, and is the head of the Land O'Lakes Dairy Foods and Purina Animal Nutrition businesses. Ray Washburn serves as President and CEO of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, or OPIC, America's premier development finance agency. Prior to his appointment at OPIC, he served as President and CEO of Charter Holdings, a real estate investment company he founded more than 30 years ago in Texas. And of course, we're pleased to welcome back our very own Senator Chris Coons, along with Liz Schreier, who will moderate this discussion. So to Beth, Ray, Chris, and Liz, good luck.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Okay.
Welcome back. Welcome, everybody. We're in for a wonderful conversation. And somebody from the administration, senator, and the private sector. So this is going to be a terrific conversation to look at America is America keeping pace in a competitive world? So I'm going to do a couple rounds with our expert panelists, and then we're going to open it up to a conversation. You already set a high bar of what we're going to talk about. But I want to start, if I can, we're going to talk about the Build Act, because this was an amazing achievement. I was lucky enough to be at a celebration 2 days ago with Ray and Senator Coons, and we're going to talk about it. But I want to just dig a little deeper into the world we live in and get the three of your perspective on how challenging it is and why we need the Build Act. So, Senator, I'm going to ask you first. You have, as you said, traveled a lot, 29 just countries in Africa alone.
That's over 8 years.
Okay. It's a lot. It's amazing. And so that gives you a really unique perspective of understanding the challenges our nation faces and also the opportunities.
Yes.
And what is amazing is I had our staff take a look. You have, in your years in the Senate, you have led, sponsored or co-sponsored 120 pieces of legislation that advance our national security, advance these development and diplomacies. Just as an example of one for our audience, one of them was just recently getting $8 billion to address the humanitarian crisis of the refugee migration issue. It's amazing what you've done. So maybe you could just start, is give a couple of perspectives, you gave a few when you talked openly, of what you see that strengthens your resolve that America has to be engaged in the world, has to stay engaged, and what we lose if we retreat. So set this up so when we get to the Build Act, why we needed it so badly.
Thank you, Liz. Tomorrow, I'll be in Halifax, Canada, with a dozen senators, Republicans and Democrats, and with Cindy McCain. Last year, I was at the Halifax conference with John McCain. It was a new administration. It was a new day. And there were representatives there from dozens of our treaty partners in NATO, from Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Western Europe, and North America. And we had a lot of conversations because at the dawn of a new administration, there was a lot of concern, a lot of uncertainty about exactly what our relationship would look like with Europe, with NATO, what would our trade policies look like, what would our development and security and defense policies look like. There are a lot of folks around the world who are anxious about America's role and where we're headed. And I spent a lot of time last year with John doing what I'd call a reassurance tour. We went to Vietnam and Singapore to a major Indo-Pacific security conference as well. It is important for our allies to see bipartisan partners in the Congress and administration officials reassuring our allies that we are not leaving NATO, that we are not in a hostile posture with the EU, that we are not leaving our vital alliances in the Pacific, and that we continue a forward posture in how we engage with them. We have two critical competitors, a peer competitor today in China and a spoiler in Russia, who in most of Eastern and Central Europe, Russia is causing enormous challenges for democracy and the stability of the NATO alliance and our relationship with the EU. And in the Indo-Pacific, China is advancing at a stunning rate. What has made the United States safe, prosperous, and I think a progressive leader in the world is our alliances. If you're going to walk into a bar fight, here's a hypothetical for you, and you're a short, bald guy who's not exactly the most athletic thing on the planet, you might want to bring two big guys with you. And that is exactly where we are globally. If we want to be successful in a competitive and robust and difficult world, our businesses are terrific in their leadership and their values. Our tools and our institutions and our structures are significant. But to miss the opportunity to do it in partnership with allies that share our values is to miss on a key opportunity for this century. So I hope I didn't overshoot the mark, but I've heard and seen that concern, and we can and should do things that reinforce our willingness to partner. Let me close with this. Every one of our major allies has a development finance institution that has these tools that we're now handing to Ray Washburn to exercise on behalf of the Trump administration. The ability to do equity projects, the ability to do local currency loans, the ability to syndicate. Now Ray's going to be leading those kinds of projects on behalf of our country and able to partner with Norway, with Japan, with Germany, with the United Kingdom. There's dozens of other countries that want American leadership in these development projects, and now we're going to be able to do that. That helps weave us together in how we use American private capital to lead development in the world.
So, Ray, I want to pick up on this China, this question about competition. You started as a businessman before we were lucky enough that you were willing to add to your public service. And you've been traveling also a lot, particularly in Africa, Latin America. You're seeing the competition. So I want to before we introduce what you're doing with the development finance, talk about just this challenge of what you're seeing on the competition landscape that led you to set the stage of what is you're seeing on the competition. China's One Belt, One Road is 7 times the Marshall Plan alone. They've upped their game on development, their development program, 520% in Africa alone. What are you seeing out there when you travel?
Well, the greatest part, well, thank you again for having me.
We love
today.
having you.
And Senator Coons and I, when we first met, I guess over a year ago, we sat down, we realized, even though Democrat and Republican, we had a lot in common. We spent a lot of time in Africa together. I've spent a lot of time personally there in my previous personal life in Zambia, working in the inner city there. So I looked at it from the lens when I first came in. I could see the lack in these developing countries is a lack of capital. But I guess the biggest education I got coming here is I went to Lusaka, Zambia, get off the airplane. I'd been there multiple times over the years. The first thing you see is a new airport being built. Massive, beautiful airport. For a country, it gets about 10 flights a day. Then as you leave the airport, there's a beautiful billboard that says, "Welcome to Zambia, Bank of China."
Yep.
Chinese writing under there. And so that was kind of an eye-opener change in the last few years. But what you find out is these countries are getting indebted by the Chinese. They have what's called a loan, what I call a loan-to-own program, and they're making loans with the full intention of foreclosing the assets and taking them back. They did it in Sri Lanka. They built this beautiful port that is basically the gateway to the Indian Ocean that gets 2 ships a week, multi-billion dollars. After the government couldn't pay it back, the Chinese took it. Well, now they have a deep water port for their future Navy to have going into and kind of controlling the entrance in the Indian Ocean. But throughout sub-Saharan Africa, I just got back from Panama, El Salvador, and Colombia. The same thing, the Chinese are everywhere. They compete differently than we do. They cheat. They're corrupt. They bribe. And I'm not saying anything that's anything secret. That's the way. They don't have laws like we have. Our businesses have to deal on top level, everything transparent, above board. The Chinese don't deal that way, but these countries are now finding they're taking this immense debt on, and the Chinese are now starting to knock on the door, and there is going to be a day to pay. And when it is, if you can't pay, for example, in Lusaka, they can't pay for the airport, they'll not only take the airport back, they'll take other collateral. It could be a copper mine, a lithium mine, other natural resources. So I think there's a big wake-up call worldwide now, and so when I came into this job, it was a little bit on the horizon. The microscope on it has really widened in the last year. And when we went up for the BUILD Act, which we'll talk about in a few minutes for the legislation, at first, you know, the people on the far right and far left are like, why are we doing all this? And as part of the legislation, we even got some Freedom Caucus people like Mark Meadows to not only support us, they came to our signing the other day. And so that shows a bipartisan support we realized of the Chinese coming in. Last story, I was in Panama about 3 weeks ago. And those of you who've been to the Panama Canal, you realize there are ports on both, container ports on both ends of the Panama Canal. There's 6 of them. 5 are controlled by the Chinese. A lot of them controlled by state-owned enterprises that front as a private enterprise, but it's really the Chinese. Well, that's a choke point in worldwide commerce, is controlling the Panama Canal. So we had to go down, and they're about to bid out the next port to say, the U.S. government is here to help support, through OPIC, the organization I run, because we can give U.S. companies debt, we can give them political risk insurance, we can give them equity now, we can do a lot of things that a normal commercial bank can't do, and so a U.S. company dealing on the high ethical standards that they do, they wouldn't go there otherwise. And so once Congress was aware of exactly that soft power tool we had to have,
That's great.
we went there. But and in closing, the DFIs, we talk about every other country in the world.
DFIs is Development Finance Institutions.
Financial.
Yep.
Whether it's the Germans, the English, the Canadians, they have one. They're all sector focused. The Europeans are primarily interested in Africa. Other countries like Japanese, Indo-Pacific. Other than the Chinese, we're the only ones with a worldwide footprint. We have operations at OPIC in 130 countries, 800 projects. And so we have to be the leader. And other countries are following our lead wherever we go. But now that the BUILD Act came through, no one in the United States, when I took this job, they all thought I was running OPEC. And I thought I was running the oil cartel. But when you go into any other country in the world, they know exactly what OPEC is, what OPEC could do, and there was a lot of terror that OPEC was going to be absolutely eliminated. But when we show up in countries now, they're like, thank you that the United States government is here and that they're leading
back.
again. And so,
We're going to talk about how it's expanded, but I want to add to the complexity because it's about business competition, but it's also about our values, and it's also about the stability of the world. And Beth, you run a major multinational company, and one of the issues that people think of you just about butter, but Land O'Lakes is way more than that. And one of the issues I want, it's just about butter?
No, it really isn't.
But
We sneak up on people, I just want you to know that.
yeah.
so I want you to talk about it, but this is the issue, one of the issues I want you to touch upon is something that the Senator talked about in his opening, but is global hunger. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I have noticed is for years it was going down, 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 and all of a sudden it's had this spike. Mm-hmm. And it's had a spike for a lot of the reasons that actually Ray is dealing with. And there are still 821 million people that go to bed hungry every day in this world. And Land O'Lakes is doing some incredible work in this space. You are engaging with small shareholder farmers worldwide. You have invested in programs where you're helping bring income up of farmers in some countries in Africa, 75%. And it's extraordinary. And I wonder if you can touch upon why a company like Land O'Lakes is getting involved in investing in small shareholder farmers, in investing in some of these same kind of conversation we're starting to have, and why a company like Land O'Lakes is in this global ecosystem.
Right. Well, first of all, thank you for saying, and thanks for having me, and thanks for saying we're more than a butter company, because I think that would describe why we're there. So Land O'Lakes, for those of you who don't know, was founded in 1921 by Upper Midwest dairy farmers who wanted to get their sweet cream butter into the population centers in the East, and that was successful. Then they formed a supply co-op, which included an animal feed business. Now we are a broad, Fortune 200, $15 billion company, and we work right on the acre with farmers, with growers, with producers, and we are farmer-owned. We retain that farmer ownership. So to your question, why are we there, and what is this about? I want to go back to your commentary, Senator, on your values. Our work internationally actually began 35 plus years ago, and we've done projects around the world, and it was based on the values of these farmers who saw the world as their neighborhood and wanted to make sure that they could apply their expertise in agriculture and animal agriculture and other areas to help their neighbors, to make sure that they could bring up food security and address these hunger issues around the world. And so now we've worked with USAID and other organizations to try to get funding to work in countries around the world. So for us, there's a values issue, and then there's a pragmatic business issue, right? There's a pragmatic business issue. Probably 90 to 95% of our business is actually domestic, but we're stepping in overseas, and so where do we get a good view of what the market opportunities are? Where do we get experience? Well, it's my colleague John Ellenberger is here. John used to run our dairy business, but why do we put somebody with John's expertise running our development group? Because he has the business expertise and understands how we can create markets in different countries. When we worked in, probably a great example is in Kenya, where we had expertise, we had experience over 20 years, we more recently started to invest ourselves in that country, putting in an animal feed platform, and we'll expand operations there. So there's some pragmatic business reasons we do it, but it's also consistent with our values. We recognize dealing with global hunger issues and dealing with our expertise in animal agriculture, in production agriculture, can be helpful in addressing that challenge around the world, and that's who we are from a values perspective, and certainly who our farmer members are.
So it's fascinating that these are all part of stabilizing the global arena and good for America business. So Ray, let me go back to you for a moment. So I was watching this Build Act come together. So tell us about this new DFI, as you describe it, double the financial lending authority. Why is that important to America?
Well, why is it important to America? Well, it's a soft diplomacy tool that we have. And I'll give you an example. In the northern triangle of Latin America, which is El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, you see the immigration issue we have in the United States coming from those areas. Why? They don't have a job. Do people want to leave their home? No. Did I want to leave Texas nice and warm, come to cold Delaware? No. But really.
We all want to be in Delaware.
He wanted to.
I got off the train and saw the snow, and I knew I was out of Kansas. But when we look in an area like that, and as I said, I've been to all those countries. We have teams of people down there. They need jobs, and jobs aren't only just loaning money. They need infrastructure to create those jobs. Electricity, they need clean water, they need rules of law down there that understand so American businesses will go in there. So the big part of our soft diplomacy isn't putting boots on the ground, putting airplanes, fighter jets on the ground. It's creating jobs and empathy for people down there. And so where OPIC can lead is, I spent a good bit of my time going around. OPIC was a bit of a sleepy agency because it wasn't marketing itself, I found, to people like Land O'Lakes and different ones to say, we're here, we'll provide the equity, and we, as the senator said, we are no cost to the taxpayer at all. We made $280 million last year for the U.S. government. You don't hear that very often.
That's a good one.
And
good
we're not
return
doing
on
that.
investment. That's an applause.
But we make that money, loaning money at like 5 or 6% interest rates, but we're able to give 10 and 20-year loans. So the encouragement of areas like that is, let's create jobs, let's build a bigger port in Honduras, let's build a hydroelectric plant in Guatemala that can create electricity for 40,000 homes and businesses. That creates the economic opportunity, or the flywheel, to get these economies going. That is close to home, that's on our front doorstep, and it's something we can do, and U.S. businesses are very, very receptive to it. When I went out to visit with them, Citibank and Wells Fargo, they've taken a real hands-off approach to many of these countries because they just don't trust the risks there versus the return that they can make elsewhere.
Ray, you also invested heavily in women.
Yes. So one of the things when I got there, I realized I'm a former banker as well. I've owned some banks. Our best credit risk is women, not men. And so, no, but really.
Who likes that?
And as these emerging economies are coming up, what people don't realize is that women need access to credit. And a lot of these banks and countries have a bias against loaning women money, whether it's India, Sub-Saharan Africa, or elsewhere. So I recruited a team in, and I started a thing called the 2X Initiative. We initially put in $350 million. It's now grown to $3 billion. We brought in other G7 countries with us. Again, America is the leader in this, and these other countries came in with us, but we're having the lead. And what we do is we'll go to banks, and now with fintech, as you know, I've traveled to a lot of horrible places in this world. You go to the worst slums in the world. Everyone's living on dirt floors. You know, hundreds of people sharing a toilet facility, but guess what? They all have a cell phone. And so with cell phones today, we can now go and make microloans through local banks to help get businesses started. And you've heard the old stories, the microloan, give someone $10 and they buy a little bit of thread and they start something. We're trying to up the game on that in a much bigger way to where we give them more access to credit. They're not leaving the village, but what they need is clean water. Women own businesses. They need electricity, they need clean water, they need time to run their businesses. And the time comes from not having to walk 5 miles to get clean water. It's not having to go find electricity somewhere. And so this 2X initiative has really caught on, and we've got these other governments coming behind us to provide really access to credit for women businesses.
So this piece of this legislation would never have gotten over the finish line if it wasn't for your senator. Ray has led it absolutely beautifully, but Senator Coons drove this over the finish line. You had some interesting partners.
I had some great partners.
And Cher, you had one that ran for Congress
Against foreign aid.
against
Yep.
foreign aid.
Yep.
So share how this whole coalition, and it goes back to what you said at the beginning, that this is bipartisan. So what drove you to capture this interest? Why did you care about it? And share about somebody named Ted Yoho from Florida.
So Ted Yoho, probably known to everyone in this room, is a congressman from Florida. Ted is a leader in the Freedom Caucus. He is a very conservative congressman,
Yes.
Probably the most conservative member of the House I've spent time up close and personal with, other than Ted Poe, who's been a good friend and a colleague on a tax bill I've tried to run the last couple of years. Can I get an amen? Ted Poe is also, right next to each other. But I will say, Ted Yoho has been wonderful to work with on this bill. When he got to Congress, he had run on the idea that foreign aid and foreign assistance was a complete waste of money, something he was going to fight hard to make sure it all got cut to the bone and got shut down. And that was a sort of a basic plank of his campaign for Congress. The great thing about Ted is he dug into it. He learned about the programs. As he got to understand OPEC and how OPEC actually works to return taxpayer money, it generates a profit for the taxpayers of the United States and uses private capital, not public capital, to incentivize development. He became fixated with this model and excited about it. And so when we had a chance to talk about the possibility of modernizing and growing our 40-year-old development finance institution, OPEC, he was on board and he was a leader in it. So he got not just Mark Meadows, who's the head of the Freedom Caucus in the House, who could have killed this bill easily, on board. He also got Mick Mulvaney at OMB to be on board and to fight for it. So we had an advocate within the administration who easily could have otherwise killed the bill. We had an advocate within probably the farthest from me ideologically caucus in the House to be on board with it. And then we had wonderful support from grassroots organizations, from the One Campaign to the Center for Global Development to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So we had ground game, we had air cover, and then we built the infrastructure in the middle, and then we landed and took the beach, and it was a lot of fun. So Ted Yoho was probably my most unlikely partner in this. He and I had a truly memorable burger summit with a guy named Bill Gates, who came into town and wanted to thank the two of us for our work on this. Where do you go for lunch with the richest, now second richest man on the planet? He took us to Shake Shack in Union Station.
All right.
And I'll tell you, Ted, it was a delight to watch somebody who was not at all a believer in foreign assistance, was hostile to it, sitting there over,
That's great.
a burger, fries, and a very tasty milkshake, listening to one of America's most successful, most iconic entrepreneurs, who has used his wealth and his success to, in a very targeted, evidence-based, and effective way, intervene in areas in the developing world where the Gates Foundation has been able to scale up and to finance significant interventions that have tackled public health problems, that have tackled others of the issues that you've talked about, the empowerment of women, access to water and power, and to have Ted as a partner in this has been just an enormous blessing. This afternoon we'll get to hear from Bob Corker, a very successful businessman in the private sector. My very first trip overseas as a senator 8 years ago was with Bob Corker. I'll finish the sentence. And Bernie Sanders and Joe Manchin.
That's a group.
If we had recorded, if we'd had a camera in the back of the C-130 as we were banging around between Pakistan and Afghanistan, the arguments we had were fantastic. I'll just say I came back from that trip thinking Bob Corker was going to be a great legislative partner for my time in the Senate, and I was right. We've done more than a dozen bills together.
You've done a lot.
And Bob's made a lot of this possible. So
He sure has, both of you.
I just think without Ray as the capable, engaged, well-regarded, seasoned banker in the administration talking this up, without Ted Yoho, without Bob Corker, this never would have happened. They have been wonderful partners, and I'm grateful for the blessing of the opportunity to serve with you, Ray.
Absolutely. Just to close the loop on the private sector, what's interesting is Land O'Lakes has partnered with OPIC, I think in Malawi, to improve farmers' access to markets, financing to boost agricultural trade. And a lot of people always say, why doesn't the private sector just do this on their own? And maybe you can comment on why this ecosystem is so important. Why does it all have to work together?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. First of all, I'm enjoying your stories because I feel like I'm inside baseball. I just want you to know that. And I don't see a lot of that, right? And so this is very helpful to understand how that's done. So why would we want those partners? Well, because businesses want to de-risk their entry into markets like this. And especially in agriculture, we always say, even here in the United States, it can either be too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry. And it can drive variability in outcomes for different things that our growers, our producers are working on. And I'd say that same thing is very much the case in international markets. So having a partner and then using different funding mechanisms for projects that we're working on through USAID and now and partnering with OPIC, like you say in Malawi, here on, I think that looking at horticulture, portable horticulture and replacement of tobacco growing, all of those things provide a de-risking lever for businesses to walk into that. So if from my perspective as the CEO, if I'm asked, can I make an investment directly in Malawi? Well, that's riskier for me if I don't have partners. In fact, when we lead and when we go into different countries, we always want to partner up and not take the asymmetric risk of a major investment. And so that's why these things are so important, and this kind of ecosystem is so important for businesses.
Let's bring this back home and start with you, Senator. How does this 1% connect of the international affairs budget? When you travel around the state, how do you make the connection of 29 trips to Africa, the BUILD Act, connect it to the first state of our union? It's 11 o'clock. Well, we can still do one more meeting, p.m.
It's part of the fun. How does it connect to Delaware? That's the case I was sort of laying out along with our Secretary of State at the beginning. Whether it's a world-class port that is a produce port that is landing whole shiploads of bananas and clementines and grapes, things that we don't grow here in Delaware, but that make possible high-quality jobs, $80,000 a year or more, for folks with a high school diploma. There just aren't jobs of that quality and caliber here anymore. When I was growing up, you could go get a job at the GM plant or the Chrysler plant straight out of high school, raise a family, live a great life, have a little beach place, have a boat, have some savings for retirement, send your kid to college. I mean, that was the backbone of the middle class of this community. The steel plant in Claymont, the oil refinery down in Delaware City, and our 2 auto plants. Well, 3 out of 4 of those are gone. Financial services has filled a lot of that. But companies like Corteva, companies that are innovative and are manufacturing and are developing new products and services for the world that are global are a big part of our employment in this state. In the southern 2/3 of our state, poultry and the grains that feed poultry is the backbone of our agriculture sector. And without exports, poultry does not grow. At least 10% of the chickens grown in the United States are sent overseas. And without getting into too much detail, the most profitable part of the poultry sector in Delaware is the parts of the chicken that we send to other places in the world where they eat it and we don't. And there's a whole lot of amusing stories there. But I'll tell you, one of the things that is a challenge is opening new markets overseas. Johnny Isakson's probably my best friend in the Senate. He is the chair of ethics I'm ranking. When I was first the chair of the Africa subcommittee, Johnny was my ranking. He's from Georgia. They raise more chickens in Georgia than any state in America. We raise more in Sussex County than any county in America. We founded the Chicken Caucus together. Yes, sorry. Why does this matter? We went to South Africa on one of our first trips. A vibrant, sizable economy at the very southern end of the African continent and the gateway into at least 7 other countries. They had blocked our poultry from access to South Africa for years, using the same tools or the same violations of WTO rules that much bigger economies like India and China use. Johnny and I set to work on it, and to make a long story short, after 5 years and a whole bunch of meetings, and frankly threatening to take away their access through the African Growth and Opportunity Act to the American market, they agreed to open the South African market to exports. And today, companies you know, like Purdue or Mount Air, are exporting millions of dollars of poultry from the United States into the South African market. And that showed the pathway for our to access the Indian and Chinese markets in the future. We have to have a level playing field and fair trade rules for our Delaware exports to make it to the rest of the world, and we have to have modernized infrastructure like the new Port of Wilmington that's going to be built in the coming years, and open markets for our ability to benefit from the high quality jobs in produce and in our port. We all win when the world has free, fair, and open markets that play by level playing field rules. I support President Trump's effort to go after Chinese theft of our intellectual property and some of the ways in which their mercantile policy has not been on a level playing field. And I think it's important that we find a solution to the U.S.-China trade relationship, which is the linchpin of the global economy in this century. I have had questions or concerns about the ways in which tariff practices have instead, unfortunately, harmed our relationships with close allies like South Africa and Sweden and Finland, which lands about 10 ships a year of steel in the Port of Wilmington. It all comes back to the Port of Wilmington. And I am hopeful we can make progress in focusing our trade work on the issues that we can resolve and that can move our economy forward and can get us onto a better level playing field globally, and that we can reduce needless conflict with close partners and allies like Canada or Sweden or South Africa.
I want to take time for some questions, but OPIC's had about $800 million invested in Delaware. Any real quick comment about how it relates here?
Well, first I'm going to say the chicken parts he's talking about that we don't want here, we send. That's how we get back to the China. That's how we get back at the Chinese. Send them the parts we don't want.
Send them the feed.
No, but OPIC has done since in the last 40 years over $800 million worth of loans in Delaware and the region. One very recent deal we did is not here, but it's in Camden, New Jersey. It was with a company called Holtec that, of all things, they bury nuclear fuel rods in Ukraine, and that was paying Russia $50 million a year to take them. They now bury them at Chernobyl. And so all the casings and things are made in Camden. So that ended up employing 400 high-paid jobs in Camden to make that equipment to send over there. So, no, but we're very open.
Great. You're open for business.
We're absolutely open for business, especially in the Port of Wilmington. Now I know so much about that. So
all right, you're ready, and you've got a number of dairy co-ops right here.
We do. We have one of our largest producers, the Hopkins family, about 1,000 head. You know, the point I'd make about this is that export markets are critical to farmers, absolutely critical. And you say, the shipments of chicken, 1 of 7 days of a dairy production is shipped and is exported. So export markets are absolutely critical for us. And that's why we want to continue to invest. Probably, 95% of the world's population is outside the United States. The most productive farmers in the world are the American farmers. And so we're all about and supportive, just as you note, expanding markets and getting fair trade agreements. That is critical to the growth and the stability of our farmers here in the United States, and is better for all of us.
Raise your hand. We have a couple staff people who have microphones, and they'll come around. So if you have questions for any of our panelists,
Back.
Alex and Maddie are right in the back here. There's a bunch right here.
Actually, we're going to ask people to come to the microphone.
Really? Okay. Why don't we take 2 at a time? 2 questions. Just introduce yourself.
My name's Clem Dinsmore. There are 2
Just
sobering
hold the mic a
realities.
little closer to you, so we can hear.
Clem Dinsmore, a resident of Wilmington. There are 2 sobering realities that we all know about that I wonder how they influence your thinking. One is global climate change, which is destroying human and physical capital in massive amounts. We don't have to look beyond North Carolina or California to know that. And 2, the financial condition of our nation is deteriorating very rapidly. And the interest costs are soon going to be the major element of our budget in excess of the defense budget. So the question is, to what extent and how does consideration of the societal disruptions and capital destruction that is associated with climate change influence the strategies that you all pursue?
Okay, thank you. One over here.
Good morning. Senator Coons, Honorable Ray, and Beth. My name is Jean-Claude. I'm originally from Africa. I'm the VP of Agro Solutions Africa, been educated in the U.S. A few things that I've heard this morning was alliance and values. I'd like to know what at the center of your core strategy, where do you put the African diaspora when it comes to Africa? One of the key things when you're looking at what's happening in Africa, especially with China, China had a strategy to fill a void. So there's a lot of people that came from some of these countries that have been educated here, understand the values of America, and I believe they should be at the center of that alliance when it comes to what you're doing there. And we're ready to work and partner with Land O'Lakes. Thank you.
And let's get one more here so we can try to get as many questions as we can. And then you can, and we'll try to just real quick, if you can be as short as possible.
Yes, I'll try. My name is Echazu Ogu, Dr. Echazu Ogu. I live in Newark, Delaware. To begin with, I'd like to thank Senator Coons for his excellent representation of this state and this country. Thank you, Senator Coons.
Thank you.
My question is to Mr. Washburn. The point you make about the Chinese second colonization of Africa is very well taken. But I have a question for you. I've raised that issue with some important Africans, and they said to me, they dismissed me. They said, look, this is what the U.S. was doing to us for years. And now they're complaining because the Chinese are doing it. So what should I tell those people? What's the difference? Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll take one last one over here, and then we'll probably have to stop.
All right, hi, my name's
I
Leanne Vosch.
apologize if we don't get to everybody.
It's all right. My name's Leanne Voschel. I'm actually from the University of Delaware. I'm a Rhodes Scholar. I was just wondering, because you mentioned like Chinese business practices and combating that in the Panama Canal. I was just curious what other legislation has been passed and what other things have been, what other measures have been taken to combat that in regards to, I guess, like corporate social responsibility as well as like human rights abuses.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have climate, Africa diaspora, and a lot of China. And what else is up on the horizon, in particular on human rights?
Sure.
So do you want to kick them off, and then if the two
Let me try to briefly speak to all of those questions if I can. First, as some of you who've attended this conference in the past know, I think America's unique strength in engaging with the continent of Africa and in competing with China and other countries, whether it's the EU or Brazil or elsewhere, is the African diaspora in the United States. We have a broad, robust, deep diaspora that came to the United States often for higher education and opportunity, but retain close communication and contact with their countries of origin. In the last administration, we had a number of events around trying to mobilize the diaspora. One of the pieces of the BUILD Act is the potential to issue literally diaspora bonds as a way to aggregate capital, interest, and knowledge in development projects in particular countries. I think we can and should do more to take advantage of the robust diaspora communities in the United States, whether from South Asia, whether from Central America, or whether from Africa. One of the things I repeat probably more often than everyone would like is that the highest educated, most successful diaspora community in the United States is the Nigerian diaspora. That is not widely understood and appreciated. I got to experience it here in county government, working with folks who either represented our community on boards or who were senior engineers or physicians or business people. We have a huge untapped source of potential there, first. Second, in climate change, obviously I have differences with the administration, with some of my closest friends on the Republican side. I'll say this, some of the real leaders in tackling climate change are America's corporations, which have committed to sustainability, have found ways to make it measurable, and to sick engineers on the problem, and to demonstrate that you can actually be a more profitable company while being a more sustainable company. I think at the end of the day, finding a bipartisan way to enact a carbon tax that is not a new revenue source for the American government, but is a way to move through market mechanisms to deal with the challenges of climate is a promising policy development for this next Congress. We'll see if we can make any progress on that. Last, on ethics. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is decades old, requires American companies to engage in business in the developing world in a transparent and ethical way, a restraint that our Chinese competitors do not face. The Chinese go to country after country and say, we will not interfere in your domestic politics. We won't ask difficult questions about journalists, about dissidents, about communities that may be marginalized or oppressed. That's not our business, that's your business, we respect you. And that is a welcome approach in many countries. But it also sometimes is a cover for abuse of power. We come with a different value set, and American companies, more by choice than because of government fiat, end up showing how it is possible to do business in countries where the rule of the law is not yet fully settled in a way that actually advances human development. So I'm proud to partner with American business and the ways in which they work in the world. Yes, there is a tragic and long history of mistreatment, in particular of Africa and Africans, through colonialism. That is not where we are today in terms of America's engagement as a true development partner with our African partners. And I think if we look at how China is conducting itself on the continent and how the United States is conducting itself on the continent today, we can be proud of how we're engaging with our real partners in development.